My name is Zach Gardner. I have been a software developer. I did the math for about 20 years. I started developing when I was 14, and if I shaved my beard, I promise you, I would look 14 years old. It is like mind-blowingly crazy. I work for a company called Keyhole Software. I'm assuming you all know about Keyhole Software because, we got this awesome banner. I'm on LinkedIn all the time. I have the best GIFs this side of the Mississippi. I'm the chief architect, which means everything that goes right is someone else's. Everything that goes wrong is my fault. Totally fine. It's what, being the chief is. We work in healthcare, banking, finance, insurance, agriculture, manufacturing, construction. I think the only thing I haven't done is put something down in the ocean at this point. That's on my bucket list, though. And actually, this is sort of a homecoming for me. When my very first time at KCDC was right before my oldest daughter was born, I was working just up the street at DST, which is now SS&C, and like my presentation was literally in this room, which is just like, it's so weird. And again, if I shaved, I would look exactly the same. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about GraphQL and Flutter, of course, because this is why you're here. You all want to see not just me and my awesome face and the fact that I actually memorized this whole 50-minute presentation and can do it in case my laptop blue screens, which do Macs blue screen? That's only a Windows thing, right? So hopefully, knock on wood. We're going to go through sort of the context. What was the rationale for me to actually start to play around with GraphQL and Flutter? Why is it better than some of the other options? How are we asked by clients to be able to implement this? And what are some of the key takeaways that you all can get out of this? So let us start by asking two questions. There's two questions that no matter the vertical, no matter the industry, no matter where the company is coming from, there's always two questions that we essentially get. Like if you boil it down to the essential oils, this is what everyone asks us. Is the first, how do you take legacy applications, some of which comprise a vast majority of any large IT systems portfolio? Oftentimes these legacy applications were written like 10, 15, 20 years ago. No one really understands how they work anymore. Maybe everyone that was working on them has retired. I mean, I see some nods in the room. This is definitely not a novel problem. And unfortunately, changes are going to happen. Log4j is going to have a critical vulnerability that you needed to patch and support. And if you don't have people that actually know how to build this thing, if you don't have people that are understanding where the skeletons are, heads are going to roll. So, because business is going to go down, they're not going to be happy. So a lot of the clients that we work with want to get ahead, pun intended, of this problem. They want to be proactive. They want to figure out, how can I take my legacy applications and modernize them? But you can't take the whole thing down, right? Production can't be down for 15 weeks simply because you're like, oh, well, I'm rolling out a new version. I mean, if you said that to any executive, they're going to look at you like you have three heads, because that's just not how the business works. So how do you incrementally move the ball forward? How do you make sure that you're able to keep revenue coming in, because that's what's paying your mortgage payments? Spoiler alert. How do you eventually get to a place where you just sunset all the old code, get the new code running? That's the first question that essentially everyone asks us. The second question is, well, we have new ideas for new applications. Some of these are very ephemeral. Some of these don't have requirements. It might be a simple email. It might even be as simple as a CEO or a CIO has an idea for something that they want to do. They don't know the business case. They don't know the customers. They don't really know much of anything other than that they have an idea. So whatever you pick to answer the first question, how do you modernize legacy applications? You also have to use to be able to answer the second question, is how do we create these modern applications? Again, spoiler alert, GraphQL is where I would recommend from the API side for how to do this. And I'll actually go through a sample use case. In order to make this presentation, I read through hundreds of hours of white papers, of case studies, of architects just talking about where they were coming from, what they did, what worked well, what didn't work well. And just show of hands, how many of you in the audience are Netflix subscribers? Yeah, I am too. I'm going to be talking about Netflix. There's no financial conflict of interest. Netflix is not paying me to talk about their case study. In fact, I pay them $14.99 a month. So if anything, if you're out there, Netflix, send some Bitcoin my way. Netflix, you wouldn't think it, but Netflix had a legacy software problem. I remember the very first time that I encountered Netflix, it was back in probably 2004. One of my buddies showed me this little envelope. He was like, look, I don't have to go to Blockbuster anymore. Hell yeah, Blockbuster, represent. I probably still have some late fees at Blockbuster. I don't have to go to Redbox. I can just, from the convenience of my home, create a queue. I can order these things and then they just appear in the mail, which is awesome. But Netflix realized that they could only get so far just being a service that snail mailed DVDs to people. Right now, they account for probably like 15 to 20% of the internet traffic worldwide, which is like nuts, especially during the pandemic. Like it went absolutely bonkers, the amount of just data they were piping through. And so their system, which they used to be able to run their business, was a legacy, it was a Java monolithic application. And like, don't get me wrong, no shade on monoliths. Monoliths are a very, very powerful tool. If you're still coming up with your use cases, if you don't have a good handle on your business entities, if like the walls between your bounded contexts have not yet calcified, like by all means, make a monolith, get it into production, start generating some of that, some of that cha-ching, and then treat it, as Martin Fowler calls it, as a sacrificial architecture, to where you're going to replace it at one point. When that is, don't know, but treat it. Don't get married to it. Don't take it home to mom, so to speak. That's a good way to think about monoliths for some use cases. For other use cases, they're absolutely appropriate. But their monolith could not take them to the point where they needed to go. They could not become the streaming powerhouse that they are with just a single deployable unit. You might be able to do it, but that is just so much risk that you're putting in, and you want to be able to manage the risk. So they did some soul searching because they're Netflix. I'm sure they watched Eat, Pray, Love. They really thought about what it is that they were trying to accomplish. And they landed, this was in 2013, I believe, when they started making the shift. They switched over to microservices. So they started with one monolith, which had everything, and they slowly decomposed it over time into microservices, which A+, that is exactly what I would have done. But microservices only get you so far. And what do I mean by that? So if we think about some of their microservices that they have, when you go to your LOLM, your list of movies, not to be confused with an LLM, large language model, LOLM. I don't know, they're a little too similar. When you go to your LOLM and you see your recommendations, you see ratings, you see movies, those are discrete microservices. They're discrete business entities. They even go down so far as being able to have different Docker images for those and being able to deploy them in and out of Kubernetes pods. They are as separate as water is to oil. The user interface, though, still needs a little bit of help. To explain why, let's do it. Let's do a second poll. How many of you in the audience, by a show of hands, are iPhone users? How many in the audience are Android users? Anyone that didn't raise your hand, you are the thing of nightmares. I have no idea what you use. Maybe you're on Palm Pilots, or maybe you have one of those dumb phones that we're going to get my daughter, which you didn't hear that, Charlotte, by the way, in case she's watching this. So your iPhone, when you go and you look at your LOLM, maybe you're really highbrow, as iPhone users are. All you watch is documentaries. And you look at your Android neighbor. Maybe they enjoy trashy reality TV shows. No shade, Mark. If you want to watch trashy TV shows, this is a no judge zone. This presentation is a live your best life. Totally fine. But it shouldn't really matter when you think about it in terms of the API request and the API response. Because at the end of the day, you're getting movies, you're getting ratings, you're getting recommendations. And you would think that the body of the request, the body of the response, if you're on iPhone, if you're on Android, would be exactly the same thing. And if you thought that, you'd actually be wrong. There's a different URL that you hit when you're on your iPhone than you hit when you're on your Android. It even goes down to be a separate deployable unit, a separate Kubernetes pod that you hit if you're on your iPhone, your Android. If you're on your Samsung smart toothbrush and you try to go to your Netflix list of movies, it's actually different. And this is what it's doing under the covers. So you could, if you wanted to, have your phone or your phablet or Palm Pilot, whoever in the audience is still using those, like my dad, you could have it hit the movies microservice, get a response back. You could then have it hit the ratings microservice, get a response back, hit the recommendations and get it back. You could have your user interface do all the work. But if we're talking about latency, if we're talking about geolocality, that is a non-trivial amount of time for the user. And Netflix knows that time is money. So what they do instead is they have API gateways. They actually call them micro APIs, where you as the user hit a micro API whose sole purpose in life, like the reason why its mother and its father got together and it was born, was to be able to serve these requests on behalf of whoever is hitting it. Now, if they would have done a single API gateway per screen, regardless of the device, I wouldn't be giving this presentation. But they were so granular because maybe someone wants something slightly different on an iPhone than an Android, which, I mean, I don't know how many times I've had that conversation. I've built all this stuff and it's never happened, but this is the route that they went down. So they started with one monolith to 800 microservices, which if you're thinking, how do they have 800 microservices? I have not the faintest idea. I still have not seen a really satisfactory answer. They have one monolith, 800 microservices, 3,000 micro APIs for every single screen on every single possible device. And this is the part that was killing them. And the performance was great, but it was too bespoke. It was so custom that anytime they wanted to add a field to a screen, they needed to involve multiple people. Even if they had already made that property available on some other micro API, they needed to go through and add it on all the other ones. And so, as we all know, time is money. So they looked for other options and they distilled down what it is that they were trying to do. Because if you think about it, when you're on a monolith, you have everything. You can create all the requests, all the responses that you want, but it's too tightly coupled. What the user interface was really doing was kind of like a SQL query, almost. Because it was like, okay, I know I want to start with movies. So I could do a from movies. I want to then join to ratings on movie ID. I want to join to recommendations, also on movie ID. I want to be able to select some properties, to filter, to sort, to page. But you don't have to do custom code inside the database every time you want a new query, right? I mean, maybe you need like some custom code on your backend to be able to issue the query. But the database engine is an engine. You're not specifying how it's going to do this join. I mean, you can give it indexes, you can give it hints, but it's the database's job to know where the data lives and to be able to receive a request from you and then issue back a response. That's honestly all that they were doing on their APIs. So GraphQL was their answer. If anyone in the audience used GraphQL before, awesome. I love it. I am sold after I used it for the first time. The easiest way to think of GraphQL is that you're not creating custom endpoints for every single possible request and response. What you're doing instead is creating an engine, an API gateway that is able to locate the data that it needs to be able to resolve a specific query. You're giving it enough information, you're making this stuff available, but then it's up to the user interface to be able to say, this is what I want. When the user interface needs a new property, they don't need to talk to an API developer. If that property is already available on the business entity, they can just include it in their query, and then Bob's your uncle, you got what you want. And this is what a sample GraphQL query looks like. So there's one URL that everyone hits. And in this query, I'm saying, okay, give me movies. I want only 10 movies because, I'm on a plane. I don't want to download the whole world. And then I want you to give me, for every movie, the ID, the title, the release date, and then ratings. So the user interface doesn't need to know that ratings, recommendations, movies are all discrete microservices. It shouldn't care. That is an implementation detail on the API side. But when I want to pull a movie, of course, why would I not want to pull the ratings for the movie? I'm not going to watch a 2-star movie. I want to know where I got that rating from and what the score was. And then when I want my recommendations, I want to pull maybe what the recommendation was, what the title of the recommendation was, what some other people were talking about it. I can get that all in one query. And then if I wanted to change something, maybe instead of release date, I also wanted to pull director, or I wanted to pull the cast. I don't have to, I as a UI developer get to make that choice. I don't have to talk to anyone. Under the covers, it's doing exactly the same thing as this API gateway was doing. But the difference, the subtle difference, is that all of these are publishing their schema up to a central repository. And your API gateway on GraphQL is able to pull down that schema. It understands, oh, you're the movies microservice. Hello, movies microservice. These are the business entities that you own. These are their properties. And what you do at the API gateway layer is you stitch things together. So these microservices do not know each other, as they should not, from the principle of Demeter. Very weird reference if you haven't heard of it. This has to specify through configuration when I'm on a movie, but I want to pull information from ratings or from recommendations. This is how I do it. This is the method that I call. And then you get to do whatever you want. API developers don't even have to talk to UI developers anymore. It's like life is fun. Your Slack messages plummet, which if you're like me, is awesome. So the way to think about it, it's SQL for microservices. It lets you provide through a query language the ability to pull information out of all these disparate microservices as if they were all in their same database. Now, there are some caveats that I do have to give with GraphQL, because if you're like me, you're going to go guns a-blazing. You're going to try to boil the ocean with it. But one of the best posts that I actually saw was from a dev manager at Apple, who actually, his post got too viral, and I think Apple made him take it down because it was, he said that they were using GraphQL at Apple, and Apple is nothing if not super transparent about everything that they're doing. So one of the big drawbacks that he gave, the very first one, which I always tell everyone, if you're doing this, you have to think about this. Your attack surface area has just increased. Because if you think about when we do legacy API development, we have total control over every property that comes in and goes out. We have code reviews, essentially, for every single API request that we're able to serve. If you create an engine where you could service any possible query, the only thing that you could do potentially as a code review is on the UI side. And then if an attacker knows that you're using GraphQL, they can poke around, they can try to figure out what are the different properties that you have in there. Maybe on the cast of a movie, maybe you have the cast member's social security number. I don't know why you would want to do that, but theoretically it could happen. And if you don't have the ability to access that property hidden behind some sort of authorization role, guess what? You've just exposed someone's social security number. Even though it wasn't documented, security is not done through obscurity, it's done through purpose. You've opened yourself up to a big can of worms. So in order to help mitigate your surface area with GraphQL, anytime you're publishing a new version out to the internet, I would highly recommend you contact a security firm whose job is to be able to go through and look at what are the things that you're making available. They try to get in your network, they red team it, and they give you recommendations. It's honestly just the price of doing business these days, and you get to choose. Actually, it's kind of like Goosebumps. It's like a choose your own adventure. You can either choose to get sued because you didn't do your due diligence, or you can choose to pay a firm that specializes in security and can actually tell you these are the things that you're doing wrong. So the choice is yours. There's a lot of creative ways to run a business. I would recommend you do one of those two options. I won't tell you which one, though. You can probably guess. The second thing that you're going to run into is performance, which every application I've ever been on, performance has always been an issue. If you have a relational database, meaning your SQL server, your Postgres SQL, I would not recommend doing GraphQL on top of those. Because you don't have tight control anymore over all the queries that are hitting your database, you're going to miss indexes. There are things that your users are gonna put some really interesting queries together. And if you're doing join upon join upon join upon join upon join, things aren't gonna go so well for you. It gets a little bit better if you can separate your reads into a read-only database and your writes to a separate database. You get a lot of performance boosts on there, but even still, if you have a relational database, I'm sorry, GraphQL is not for you. Now, if you're on a non-relational database like a NoSQL, like by all means. I actually love using GraphQL with Cosmos because it does hot indexing, and it will look at what are the queries that are taking the longest, and it automatically adds indexes for you, which is great because I forget to add indexes all the time. But because you are exposing an engine, it's always possible that people can take advantage of that and do some queries that maybe aren't so great. So going back to this slide, Netflix is slowly transitioning away from these micro APIs and instead having their user interfaces hit the GraphQL equivalent, which is really nice for them because they can do it piecemeal. They can slowly sunset it because ultimately, whether the request is being serviced by a micro API, whether it's being serviced by a GraphQL API gateway, it's ultimately forwarding the request onto exactly the same microservices. So the database remains consistent. When code gets deployed here, both the GraphQL and the micro API see that. They're able to slowly phase it out. I think the last one that they're going to turn off, it's going to be this time next year, if I remember right. So of their 3,000 micro APIs, I think they've deprecated about 1,500 or 2,000 of them. So that is a really, really ideal strategy if you're looking at how to modernize a legacy application. You might already have microservices, maybe you have a monolith, but if you slowly migrate it over to GraphQL, you're actually setting yourself up for success in the future. Because, again, show of hands, how many of you have worked on a screen where it has never changed once you put it into production? Everyone has been happy with it. No executives have ever come to you and been like, hey, move this button over here, when you're like, that's the dumbest idea I ever heard. Good. No one's raising their hands. You all know that software changes over time. Embrace the change. And if you have your APIs decomposed into business entities, that allows you to piece together new screens. It allows you to implement new flows that you had not previously thought about. But that can only take you, honestly, so far. Who remembers when the iPhone was announced? You actually know what time it was? Anyone in the audience know what time it was, Pacific time? If you ever see an ad for an iPhone, or actually an Apple Watch, the time that shows up on there will be 9:47 a.m., I believe. I think that's when Steve came on stage and showed the iPhone. So it's a little trade secret if you don't know. When the iPhone was released, it was cool. It could do a lot of stuff, but you know what it couldn't do initially? It couldn't support an app like this. That thing had 128 megs of RAM. It had, did it even have 3G at that point? I'm not even sure if it had 3G. It's been so long. There's no way on God's green earth that this could have run on an initial version of the iPhone. And if you targeted your application to work on an iPhone when it first came out, if you first got into the App Store, and then over time it needed to evolve into something like this, that would be kind of tough. I mean, even if you separated, I don't know how many microservices Uber has, but you might have like 20, 30, 40 microservices. Maybe you could get away with it, but your user interface is constantly changing. You want to support iPhone, you want to support Android. You want to support whatever the people that didn't raise their hands are using. That's really, really difficult to do with a single user interface. When the iPhone first came out, it did not support Apple Pay, which I did not honestly realize how much I would be using Apple Pay until I started using it. It's an awesome feature, but it was something that no one, when they started writing their first version of their app, could have ever thought of. Vine. How many people in the audience remember Vine? Hell yeah. I was actually probably going to show some classic Vines instead of Fail Army. So maybe next time, if you present at KCDC, you get to determine what you show. Vine would have never worked on an original version of the iPhone, and that's okay. Neither would Netflix. Big surprise. There's no way it could have ever supported the throughput. The screen was just like so grainy, it wouldn't work. This is why we always get asked, when we deploy a version of the application, things are going well, but then the business is like, oh, we got some new features that we got to add. Can this fit into the current version of the application? Can it fit into the current architecture? And sometimes we kind of nod our head, even though in the back of our mind we're screaming into the void, screaming into the abyss, because mobile is fundamentally different than anything else. It's different than an API. It's different than a web user interface. Mobile is fundamentally different. You can go offline with this bad boy. The last time I went offline with my laptop was in, I don't know, probably an airplane. But this thing, when I drive out to rural Kansas, it ain't got any signal. How do you handle that? We have some clients that we've helped out where their application needed 100% internet connectivity, and they used it in the middle of a field, in a farm, in west of Salina. It's like nobody has internet access out there. What are you guys thinking? That cannot be a requirement. So fundamentally, this thing has less RAM. Actually, this thing has kind of a nice amount of RAM. It has offline. It doesn't have a physical keyboard. It doesn't have a mouse. It is different. And we, as consumers, our tastes change all the time. We are constantly wanting our devices to be faster. We want a notch, and then we don't want the notch, and then we want the notch again. We want support for augmented reality. We have so many things that we want out of these little devices. And just the fact that it is in our hands, that we are physically touching it, it is the closest thing to Neuralink without actually being Neuralink, because we feel like this is an extension of ourselves. And our tastes, our preferences, our proclivities change all the time. And if you get into those conversations with a director, an executive, and they're saying, well, why didn't you think of supporting this feature when you came out with the initial architecture of your mobile application? This is our fault for not explaining it to them appropriately. This is a mea culpa. This is something that we all should own. We should be more proactive with explaining to people, look, you can slowly migrate a web application. I've done it. It's okay. You can slowly migrate an API. That's okay. Migrating, you can't have multiple versions of Flutter running at the same time within the same application as multiple versions of React Native, as you can having multiple versions of, Kotlin, all on the same mobile app. There's no way that you could do it. If you could, it would be terribly unperformant. And performance is the thing that people make money off of. So we need to get out of the mode, and this is the second part of it. Modernizing a legacy mobile application in some ways is easy, in other ways it's hard. You modernize it by throwing away the code base. If you can take it so far, but once it gets to the point, once it reaches that event horizon, you have to be proactive. And this is actually what Netflix did. Their architects, to their credit, are very truthful with their executives. It hurts for them to hear it, but to modernize a legacy mobile application, it means you just kind of have to pick the best tool at the current time. And 2024, there's a few options out there. For my money, it's either React Native or Flutter. React Native is actually what I looked at first, being a React developer. I liked the idea of having the same components shared on my web application as I do on my mobile applications. There's a couple problems with that, unfortunately. What a user wants to do on a mobile device is often very different, fundamentally, than what they want to do on a desktop application. If there's any millennials in the room, you know that when you go to pay bills, if you want to do something important, you do it on this thing. If you want to doom scroll while you're watching the debate, the presidential debate, you do that on a little device. There's fundamentally different things that we do on these devices. The same is true for our business users. If you want to run a report and then you want to assign tasks and then you want to do all sorts of crazy stuff, you're not going to do it on this little device. There's simply not enough room. But if you're in the construction industry and you're walking around, you're going to a site and you want to be able to take pictures of different things, by all means, that's exactly what this thing was built for. So the whole argument of reusing your components on web as well as native, it doesn't work. You want to do fundamentally different things on it. And the other part of it is React is really good at being able to abstract out interacting with the page, right? I mean, the virtual DOM, okay, what an amazing idea that was. The DOM, what a terrible idea that was, which is cool, but it wasn't optimized for mobile. They kind of like try to jerry rig it in. And we all know if you try to jerry rig something on mobile, it's probably not going to work well. Flutter came out, Google published it probably 4, 5, 6 years ago, somewhere around there. And it uses Dart, which is like, it's kind of like JavaScript. This is what a sample class in Flutter will look like. One of the things that I'm not a big fan of are these parentheses. So in React, when you want to have a component, you always have an opening and a closing tag, right? Because it's like HTML. In Flutter and in Dart, what you do instead is you treat it like creating a new instance of a class. So you pass it the constructor arguments, so cross-axis alignment, you give it a list of children, those children then have their own parentheses, and it can get, even with the best of editors, really hard. And I've screwed up so many times where I forget a parentheses in one place and it gives me an error like way down here. And I'm like, Visual Studio Code, that is not helpful at all. Like, do your job. It's really me that wasn't doing my job. So it looks like JavaScript. It actually has a lot of the same principles as React. If you're familiar with state, if you're familiar with props, if you're familiar with a lot of the things that are very similar, they all kind of do it about the same. The other thing I don't like, these trailing commas, just like there's a special ring of hell reserved for the people that decided to do these trailing commas. I was born in Internet Explorer 6. This would have immediately like blown the browser up. I can't get over it. They did it so that, if you're curious why, if you want to add a new property, you don't have to, and you're looking at your Git commit history, you don't see this line as a change and then your new line that you wanted to add, because that's messy. If you always put a trailing comma when you add a new line, the only thing in your Git commit history that actually shows is this new line that you added, which, like, sure, I mean, I know I'm pedantic, but I don't know. That's a little too much for me. So if you went to my talk yesterday on mono repos, one of the things I always recommend, if you're in between choices, look at what everyone else is using. If you looked at market share, the number of apps that are created with Flutter, a little bit less than React Native. If you're looking at market share, a little bit less. But the trajectory of it is really interesting. I think this slide was from 2021, and every year Flutter was getting more and more and more and more, whereas React Native was staying kind of status quo. So don't look at just the numbers. Look at the context in which it is happening. If you're seeing a tool that's kind of flatlining and nobody has given it a defibrillator, but you're seeing another one that is rising in popularity, you're seeing more and more people talk about on Hacker News. If this is something that you keep seeing at conference talks, that might be a leading indicator that this is something that you actually want to consider. But important thing to remember, none of us are Nostradamus. I mean, If we were, we probably would be making a lot more money than we currently are, or we would be shorting, was Jim Cramer, whatever he recommends, just immediately short it, buy that dip. None of us are Nostradamus. None of us knows what our users are going to want 5, 6, 7 days from now, much less years from now. So pick a tool, pick whatever it is, whatever the best breed tool is for mobile that your company can support. Maybe it's Xamarin, maybe it's MAUI. If you're nuts, but you could, if that is the right tool, use that right tool for now. Accept and talk about it constantly that your users are going to be changing their requirements. You can only go so far. Always be thinking ahead about what is that inflection point? What is the pivot? When do we need to start thinking about the future? We always need to start thinking about the future. And if you're constantly in the mode of thinking about what are my end users doing? What are my end users thinking about? What are the things that they need that I'm not giving them? And I want to get ahead of my competitors. You're going to be in that cycle where probably every 2 to 3 years, you're going to do a full rewrite of your mobile application. It's so hard not to do it. You end up adding way too much legacy in there. There's just too much stuff that gets colluded in there. So if you're always thinking ahead, if you're always planning for a rewrite, your APIs, those are good. If you got good microservices, if you're using GraphQL, you can retrofit pretty much anything you want. But your mobile user interfaces, that is where, if you're not keeping pace with the industry, you're going to get left behind. Flutter is the right choice now in 2024. If I do this presentation in 2025, it might be different. I think Kotlin multi-platform might be my recommendation. Then mileage varies depending upon the vertical. But in general, if you're looking to modernize a legacy application, the APIs, you got microservices, GraphQL is probably where you should go. And if you got a legacy mobile application, you're probably going to go with Flutter. They go hand in hand really well together. It's really easy to get a Flutter development environment set up. It's too easy not to use. And out of everything that I tried, those are the only 2 things that year after year after year I could see myself using until someone comes out with something else. So those are my general recommendations. If you want any more recommendations, if you want me to talk for another hour, more than happy to. But thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for listening to me make a fool out of myself talking on the screen. I always love to talk to people, and I always like to learn from people. So thank you all very much.